6 years ago, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, doing math that refused to work. $14,000 in credit card debt. The same paycheck I bring home today. Same job, same hours. And right now, that debt is gone. There's a cushion in my savings account that doesn't flinch when the car needs a new alternator, and nobody handed me a raise to make that happen. I changed 10 things. Not 10 big things, 10 quiet habits, most of them older than the television, that families use through the hardest stretch this country has ever seen, and just called common sense. I'm going to walk you through all 10 in the order that actually builds wealth, not the order that sounds impressive on a thumbnail. And the last one is the reason the other 9 even work. Habit number 1, pay yourself first. Before the rent, before the groceries, before anything else touches your paycheck. A slice of it, even a small one, moves into savings the same day the check lands. Not what's left over at the end of the month. There usually isn't anything left over at the end of the month, and that's the whole point. Families who lived through the hardest years of the last century treated their own savings the way we treat a bill that absolutely has to be paid. 10%, sometimes less, sometimes more, but always first, always automatic, always before the money had a chance to feel like spending money. Here's the everyday version. Set up a transfer that moves money out of checking the morning your paycheck hits, before you've opened a single app or looked at a single price tag. Call it $50 if that's what you can do without flinching. The amount matters far less than the order. A household that saves what's left after spending ends up with whatever's left, which is usually close to nothing. A household that saves first and spends what remains ends up, decades later, with a completely different bank balance. Same income, wildly different outcome. Quick note before we go further. Everything in this video is general information based on historical patterns, not personalized financial advice. Your own situation always deserves its own math. None of this is exotic. It's the kind of old money habits and frugal living tips from the Great Depression that never needed a name because everyone's grandparents just did them. Habit 2 lives right next to it. Spend like you make $600 less than you actually do. Not through obvious sacrifice, through invisible adjustment. Drive the car that's 1 model year older than what the bank would approve you for. Live in the apartment 1 size smaller than your income technically allows. Order the appetizer instead of the appetizer and the entree. None of it feels like deprivation because you never let your spending stretch up to meet your income in the first place. Here's the part that surprises people. This gap between what you earn and what you actually spend isn't a side effect of the other habits. It's the fuel for every single one of them. No gap, no savings to automate. No gap, no cash sitting around to buy the good coat instead of financing the cheap one. If this way of thinking about money is new to you, hit subscribe now. The next 8 habits build directly on this one, and you'll want to see how they stack. Think about your own last 12 months. Did your spending rise every time a raise came in, dollar for dollar? That's the trap the Depression generation refused to fall into. Not because they were saints, but because they'd watched what happens to a family with no gap when the one paycheck disappears. The gap is not a punishment. It's the space where your future gets built. Habit 3 is blunt, and it was non-negotiable in Depression-era households. Never pay for something more than once while somebody else still owns it. That was the entire logic behind avoiding rent-to-own furniture stores, buy now, pay later apps, and financing plans dressed up as convenience. Picture a washing machine that costs $200 outright. Rented to own at $6 a week. That same machine quietly costs over $300 a year, and if you miss one payment near the end, the store takes it back and keeps every dollar you already paid. You owned nothing. You paid for everything. Families who'd survived the hardest years wouldn't touch that deal with a 10-foot pole. They saved until they could pay cash, or they bought it used, or they simply went without until the money existed. Here's the everyday version. That couch on 12-month financing, that phone on a 2-year contract, that subscription that auto-renews into infinity. Run the real math on what you're paying for the privilege of owning it later instead of now. Ask yourself honestly, would you buy this thing at its true total cost in cash today? If the answer is no, the debt isn't buying you the item. It's renting you a feeling. $100 in your pocket right now buys the same coat as 3 years of $9 installments. The only difference is who ends up with the coat and who ends up with nothing but a stack of receipts. Habit 4, buy it once. Before replacing anything, an appliance, a coat, a pair of boots, Depression-era households ran a rule that had nothing to do with being poor and everything to do with being deliberate. When something first started showing wear, they didn't replace it. They kept using it, maintained it, and only after several more years of honest service did they ask whether it had truly reached the end of its life. New and shiny is not the same question as broken and useless, and treating them as the same question is how ordinary people quietly overspend for decades. Think about your own closet or garage for a second. How many things in there got replaced not because they stopped working, but because something newer showed up in an ad? The everyday version of this habit is simple. When you do buy something built to last, real leather boots instead of the ones that crack in a year, a cast iron pan instead of the coating that flakes off in 6 months, you're not spending more, you're spending once. A $15 item replaced 4 times costs more than a $60 item that outlives all 4. Here's the one nobody expects to enjoy, and it ended up being my favorite. The habit that turns a service bill into a skill you own forever. Habit 5 is the one that took me the longest to actually believe. Once a year, learn one practical skill that removes a bill from your life permanently. Not a hobby, a skill with a dollar sign attached. My own turning point was a leaking bathroom faucet and a plumber's quote for $190 for what turned out to be an $11 washer and 20 minutes of video tutorials. I fixed it myself, badly, and then fixed it again correctly, and I have not called a plumber for a small repair since. That's the whole mechanism. A skill you learn once keeps paying you back every single year after, with no new investment required. Depression-era families treated this the same way we'd treat buying a stock. One year it was basic plumbing, the next year it was patching drywall, the next it was simple engine maintenance. Each one was a service they would never have to pay for again. Ask yourself, what's cost you the most in call-out fees over the last year? A locksmith? A handyman? Pick one skill from that list and actually learn it this year. Not someday, this year. And you just giving yourself a raise that never shows up on a pay stub, but shows up in your bank account anyway. Habit 6 moves outside the checkbook and into the kitchen. Stock up hard when prices are lowest, not when the pantry runs empty. Depression-era households spent September and October buying and preserving 3 to 4 months of food at harvest prices. Jars of tomatoes, dried beans, root vegetables tucked into a cool corner, meat put up while it was cheapest. A family who filled their pantry that way in autumn spent almost nothing on groceries by midwinter. A family buying week to week at winter prices spent 3 or 4 times as much for the same food. The modern version doesn't require a root cellar, a chest freezer, a case of canning jars, and 2 weekends in the fall buying in bulk when your grocery store runs its biggest sales does almost the same job. You're not just saving money, you're building a buffer so a price spike or a rough month at work can't touch what's already sitting in your kitchen. I'm curious how this lands for people watching in different parts of the country. Tell me in the comments what you stock up on when it's cheap and what you wish you'd started stocking sooner. And here's a detail most people miss. The habit isn't really about food at all. It's rehearsal for buying anything at the right time instead of the desperate time. Habit 7. Keep a second income switched off but ready. This didn't always mean a second job running at the same time as the first. More often it meant a maintained ability, a trade your grandfather didn't practice every week but could pick up within days if the mill shut down. A sewing income your grandmother kept small in good years and leaned on hard in bad ones. The specific skill mattered less than the fact that it existed and stayed current. Here's why that matters more today than it did then. Most households now depend on exactly one employer, one manager's opinion, one company's balance sheet for their entire income. That's not stability. That's concentration. The modern version is a maintained side skill. Freelance work in your actual profession. A small shop selling something you already know how to make. A certification you keep current even though you're not using it daily. You don't have to use it. You have to be able to use it fast. A household with a second income they can switch on in a bad month recovers in weeks. A household without one recovers in years, if it recovers at all. Habit 8 is the one that quietly separated families who ended up wealthy from families who ended up merely stable. They put spare money into something real instead of letting it sit in an account earning almost nothing. A vacant lot on the edge of a growing town. A few acres of farmland. Nothing speculative or exotic, just land. Bought because land doesn't rot, doesn't need constant repair, and can't simply be printed into existence the way currency can. A plot bought for a few $100s in the 1930s, held for decades, was often worth more than the family's entire original savings many times over. You don't need to buy farmland this year to use this habit. You need to ask a different question about spare money before it goes into a savings account earning nothing. Is there a real, tangible asset, property, even a small rental unit down the road, that would hold its value and grow while a savings account just sits there losing ground to inflation year after year? Habit 9 is the one that made every other habit on this list last more than a single generation. Money lessons happened at the kitchen table, out loud, before a child ever earned a dollar of their own. Kids watched the household ledger get balanced on Sunday evenings. They were handed a little cash and told to divide it, some to spend, some to save, some to give away, long before anyone used the word budget. Nobody waited for a personal finance class to teach it, mostly because that class didn't reliably exist. Here's a question worth sitting with. When did you actually learn how money works? In a classroom or by trial and expensive error as an adult? For most people, it's the second one, and it's an expensive way to learn. You don't need a curriculum to fix this in your own house. A 10-minute conversation about why you chose the cheaper option at the store, done out loud in front of a kid instead of silently in your head, teaches more than any worksheet ever will. The habits on this list only survive if somebody younger is watching you use them. Habit number 10 is the one I promised you at the start. The reason the other 9 actually add up to something instead of just feeling virtuous. It's a single number, the exact amount of money that, if you had it invested conservatively, would cover your annual expenses forever without you working another day. Say you spend $36,000 a year and a safe, boring investment yields 4%. You need $900,000 sitting in assets to be done. Not rich, done. That's it. That's the whole equation. And it takes about 30 seconds to calculate for your own life. Families in the hardest years of the last century called it different things. The day they burned the mortgage, the day the farm was paid off free and clear, but they were chasing the exact same number, even without a name for it. Here's why this one matters more than all the others combined. Every single habit on this list, the pantry, the gap between earning and spending, the extra skill, the piece of land, is just a tool for moving toward this one number faster. Without a target, saving is just a vague virtue. With a target, it's a countdown you can actually watch move. If you've ever typed how to build wealth into a search bar hoping for one clean answer, here it is. Not a trick, just 10 boring habits compounding quietly for decades. None of them require a windfall. None of them require a special talent. Paying yourself first creates the gap. The gap becomes cash instead of debt. Cash buys quality once instead of cheap 4 times. The skills you learn cut your costs permanently instead of just once. The second income protects all of it from a single bad month. And every dollar that survives all of that eventually turns into land, into a paid-off mortgage, into that one number that tells you you're actually free. None of these families were exceptional people with exceptional luck. They were ordinary people running a system, consistently, for decades, without ever calling it a system. It was just how you did things. That system never actually stopped working. It just went quiet for a while, buried under easier, more expensive habits that somebody else profited from. So if you want the short version, the debt I mentioned at the start didn't disappear because I got lucky or got a raise. It disappeared because I stopped doing 10 things the old way and started doing them the way my grandmother's generation did, quietly, for years, without a single app. If one of these 10 hit home for you, tell me which one in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. And if you want the rest of this, because this list only scratches the surface of what that generation figured out about money, subscribe. Because next time I'm breaking down the exact habit that let ordinary families pay off a 30-year mortgage in under 20. And the math on it is almost hard to believe.